When a ship sinks, most people assume the story ends there. The vessel goes down, settles on the bottom, and slowly dissolves into the sea over time until nothing remains. That assumption feels logical. Water corrodes metal. Salt accelerates rust. The ocean is vast and chemically active. Given enough time, surely everything disappears. But the reality of what happens to a sunken ship on the ocean floor is almost the exact opposite of that assumption. And the reasons why reveals something about deep ocean chemistry, pressure physics, and biological processes that most people have never considered. There are shipwrecks on the ocean floor today that have been sitting there for 2,000 years and are structurally intact enough to identify their cargo, read their construction details, and in some cases recover artifacts that are better preserved than objects stored in museums on dry land. There are also wrecks from the 20th century that have deteriorated almost beyond recognition in less than 50 years. The difference between these two outcomes has nothing to do with how old the wreck is, how big the ship was, or what it was carrying. It has everything to do with where the ship came to rest and what the physical and chemical environment at that specific depth and location does, or does not do, to the materials the hull is made from. The first thing to understand is that the ocean floor is not a single environment. It is a collection of radically different environments layered by depth, temperature, chemistry, and biological activity. The conditions at 30 meters of depth in a warm, shallow coastal sea are as different from the conditions at 4,000 meters in the abyssal plain as a tropical rainforest is from an Arctic tundra. A ship that sinks in 30 meters of water enters an environment with significant dissolved oxygen, active biological communities, warm temperatures, strong current action, and high light penetration, all of which accelerate the breakdown of organic materials and the corrosion of metals. A ship that sinks in 4,000 meters of water enters an environment that is near freezing, almost completely dark, subject to crushing pressure, largely depleted of dissolved oxygen in certain depth zones, and inhabited by biological communities so sparse and specialized that they can spend decades processing a single food source. The same physical object, a steel-hulled cargo ship, will experience completely different fates in these two environments, and the timeline of that difference is measured not in years, but in centuries. Steel corrodes in the presence of oxygen, water, and electrolytes. Seawater is an excellent electrolyte. It contains dissolved salts, primarily sodium chloride, that make it highly conductive and chemically reactive with iron. In shallow, well-oxygenated water, the electrochemical corrosion process runs continuously and aggressively. Oxygen dissolved in the water acts as the electron acceptor in the corrosion reaction. Iron atoms from the steel surface are oxidized, and iron oxide, rust, forms and flakes away, exposing fresh metal surface to further attack. In these conditions, unprotected steel corrodes at rates that can reach 1 to 2 millimeters of thickness per year in highly oxygenated, warm, turbulent, shallow water. A ship with steel plate 15 millimeters thick could theoretically lose structural integrity in as little as a decade under the most aggressive shallow water conditions, though in practice the actual process is slower and more variable because corrosion rates are not uniform across the hull surface, and because biological colonization partially modifies the chemical environment at the hull surface. The point is that shallow water wrecks are in an actively hostile environment for ferrous metals, and the degradation process is continuous and irreversible. At greater depths, the picture changes in ways that are not intuitively obvious. Below approximately 200 meters, light penetration becomes negligible and the character of the biological community shifts fundamentally. Below 1,000 meters, temperatures in most ocean basins drop to between 2 and 4 degrees Celsius and remain there regardless of surface conditions. Cold water holds more dissolved oxygen than warm water, so the upper deep ocean, between roughly 200 and 1,000 meters, is actually well oxygenated despite its depth. This is the depth zone where many significant historical wrecks lie, and corrosion in this zone remains active, though slowed by the lower temperature compared to shallow water. The cold slows the kinetics of the electrochemical reactions without eliminating them. Steel wrecks in this depth range continue to corrode, but at rates that extend their structural lifespan from years to decades or centuries depending on the specific conditions. Below approximately 1,000 meters in many ocean regions, something chemically significant happens. The oxygen minimum zone, a layer where dissolved oxygen concentrations drop to very low levels, exists in many parts of the world's oceans at depths between roughly 200 and 1,000 meters, with the most intense depletion in areas of high biological productivity at the surface. Below the oxygen minimum zone, oxygen concentrations typically recover somewhat as deep water circulation brings oxygenated water from polar regions. But in certain enclosed or semi-enclosed basins with restricted deep water circulation, the Black Sea being the most extreme example, the deep water is permanently anoxic, containing no dissolved oxygen at all, and instead containing high concentrations of hydrogen sulfide, a byproduct of bacterial sulfate reduction. In these anoxic environments, the electrochemical corrosion of steel effectively stops. Without dissolved oxygen to act as the electron acceptor in the corrosion reaction, the primary mechanism of iron oxidation cannot proceed. Ships that have sunk into anoxic deep water enter a state of near-perfect chemical preservation. The wood-hulled ancient vessels recovered from the deep Black Sea by research expeditions in recent years demonstrate this with striking clarity. Ships over 1,000 years old with intact hull planking, visible rope, and preserved surface details that would have disappeared within decades in oxygenated water. The anoxic environment did not slow their deterioration. It essentially stopped it. Pressure is another factor whose effect on shipwrecks is widely misunderstood. Water pressure increases by approximately 1 atmosphere for every 10 meters of depth. At 4,000 meters, the pressure is around 400 atmospheres, or roughly 400 times the pressure at the sea surface. This pressure does not crush a sunken ship. The ship's interior spaces, if sealed, contain air at the pressure that existed when the ship sank. Approximately 1 atmosphere. The pressure differential between the exterior seawater and the interior air would be enormous at great depth, and if the hull were intact and sealed, it would be subject to catastrophic compressive forces. But ships do not sink with sealed interior spaces. As a ship floods and sinks, water enters through any opening, equilibrating pressure throughout the interior. By the time the wreck reaches the bottom, the interior is fully flooded and the pressure is equalized. The whole structure then experiences the hydrostatic pressure uniformly from all sides, inside and outside, with no differential that would cause crushing. The pressure at the seafloor is not a destructive force on the wreck itself. It is simply the ambient condition of that environment, and a fully flooded steel structure handles it without structural failure. What pressure does affect significantly is the biological community that colonizes the wreck. Most marine organisms are pressure limited. The species that can survive at 4,000 meters are highly specialized, metabolically slow, and present in far lower densities than shallow water communities. This has a direct consequence for wreck deterioration. The biological boring, grazing, and consumption processes that rapidly destroy wooden structures and organic materials in shallow water are almost absent in the deep abyss. Wooden ship components, decking, furniture, cargo crates, structural timbers. That would be consumed by wood-boring organisms such as Teredo navalis within years in shallow water can survive for centuries in the deep ocean simply because the organisms capable of consuming them cannot survive at abyssal pressures and temperatures. This is why the deep ocean occasionally yields remarkably complete historical wrecks in which organic materials have survived alongside the metal structure. The biological colonization of shallow and mid-depth wrecks follows a predictable succession that profoundly modifies the wreck's chemistry and structure over time. In the first years after sinking, a wreck in oxygenated water is colonized by biofilm-forming bacteria that coat the hull surface. These bacteria create a chemical microenvironment at the metal surface that can either accelerate or partially inhibit corrosion depending on their metabolic type. Sulfate-reducing bacteria, which are anaerobic and thrive in the low-oxygen microenvironment beneath a biofilm, produce hydrogen sulfide as a metabolic byproduct. Hydrogen sulfide reacts aggressively with iron, forming iron sulfide compounds that can accelerate localized corrosion well beyond the rate that oxygen-driven corrosion alone would produce. Microbiologically influenced corrosion, MIC, is now recognized as a significant factor in the deterioration of steel shipwrecks and is the mechanism behind the rusticle formations that cover famous deep wrecks. Rusticles are stalactite-like structures of iron compounds and bacterial colonies that hang from corroding steel surfaces. They are not simple rust. They are complex biological mineral structures that actively participate in the corrosion process, channeling oxygenated water to the metal surface through their internal structure while simultaneously depositing iron compounds as their bacterial communities metabolize the dissolved iron ions. A wreck covered in rusticles is not being preserved by them. It is being consumed by them, slowly but continuously through a biological chemical process that will eventually reduce the entire steel structure to a stain on the seafloor. The rate of this biological deterioration is strongly influenced by depth, temperature, and the availability of dissolved oxygen, at the depths where the most famous historical wrecks lie. Between 3,000 and 4,000 meters in the North Atlantic, rusticle communities exist and are active, but the cold temperature and the long distances between the seafloor and the oxygenated surface water slow the process considerably compared to shallower wrecks. Research expeditions that have revisited the same deep wrecks over decades document measurable structural changes. Sections of deck that have collapsed, hull plates that have buckled inward as internal support structures corrode away, previously stable sections that have destabilized. The deterioration is real and ongoing, but its timescale at these depths is measured in centuries rather than decades. At shallower depths in warmer water, the same biological processes run faster, and wrecks that were structurally significant hazards to navigation a few decades after sinking have become low-profile debris fields that barely register as obstacles. The physical dynamics of how a ship comes to rest on the seafloor also determine its long-term preservation state in ways that are rarely discussed. A ship that sinks slowly, floods gradually, and settles upright on a flat, stable substrate arrives at the bottom in the best possible condition for long-term preservation. Its internal spaces remain largely intact, its structural geometry is preserved, and sediment gradually accumulates around and inside it, providing physical support to the whole structure and chemically buffering the corrosion environment as the sediment's organic content depletes local oxygen. A ship that sinks rapidly, breaks apart during the descent, or impacts the bottom at high velocity arrives in a fragmented state that offers no structural integrity and deteriorates much faster because every fragment has maximum surface area exposed to the surrounding water. The angle and speed of impact, the depth of the soft sediment layer, and the orientation of the wreck on the bottom all influence how sediment burial proceeds. And sediment burial, by progressively reducing the contact between the steel surface and the oxygenated bottom water, is one of the most important natural preservation mechanisms for seafloor wrecks. The cargo a ship was carrying at the time of sinking adds another layer of chemical complexity to its deterioration. Ships carrying coal have wrecks that remain chemically distinctive on the seafloor for centuries because the coal is essentially inert in the marine environment. Ships carrying ammunition produce wrecks that are genuinely hazardous. Unexploded ordnance corrodes and destabilizes over decades, and many World War II wrecks containing munitions are now assessed as significant environmental risks as their corroded casings approach structural failure. Ships carrying oil or refined petroleum products have wrecks where the cargo itself becomes a long-term pollution source, slowly leaking into the surrounding water as tank structures corrode. The MV Prestige, the tanker that sank off the Spanish coast in 2002, had its remaining cargo removed by remotely operated vehicles specifically to prevent this long-term contamination scenario. The ship's structure and its contents are not separate systems on the seafloor. They interact chemically and biologically in ways that affect both the wreck's preservation and its environmental impact over timescales that extend well beyond the initial sinking event. So a sunken ship is not simply a ship that has stopped. It is a ship that has entered a new environment and begun a new set of interactions with that environment. Chemical, biological, physical, and thermal. That will continue for as long as any material remains. Whether that process takes decades or millennia depends on where the ship sank, how deep the water is, what the oxygen content and temperature of that water column are, what biological communities are present, how the ship came to rest, and what it was carrying. The ocean floor is not a graveyard where things go to disappear. In many of its regions, it is the closest thing on Earth to a natural archive. Cold, dark, pressurized, and chemically stable enough to preserve objects that would have been lost within years in any surface environment. The ships resting there are not gone. They are in the process of a very slow transformation, governed by physics and chemistry that have no interest in human timescales. And that raises a question about the ships we know are down there but have never found. Vessels lost before the era of electronic navigation, whose positions were never precisely recorded, and whose wrecks have never been located. How do modern ocean survey technologies search for objects in an environment this vast, this deep, and this dark? The answer involves acoustic systems, autonomous underwater vehicles, and detection methods that would have seemed impossible even 50 years ago. I have covered that in a separate video, and the engineering behind it is as remarkable as anything we have looked at here.